Southern Cross of Alistar Kata.
This week on the Southern Cross, our regular Pacific news segment. Should New Zealand and Australia remain in the Pacific Islands Forum? Fiji's suspension from the forum has been lifted, but Prime Minister Bainimarama says he won't come back while Australia and New Zealand are still there. John Key says that Bainimarama's mouthing off, it's a joke, and the forum relies on New Zealand and Australian money. But is there a more serious debate to be had? Alistar Kata from the Pacific Media Centre filled me in. Let's start with Frank Bainimarama. So he's the Fijian Prime Minister now, following last year's election, and following that election, the Pacific Islands Forum lifted its suspension of Fiji. But Bainimarama says that he doesn't want back in while Australia and New Zealand are still in the forum. Why not?
I think there's this whole idea that Frank Viringa Bainimarama has come up with, is that as part of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, he wants Pacific Islands to be controlled or run, or all the decisions to be made by Pacific leaders themselves. As part of the Pacific Island Forum, I think he thinks that Australia and New Zealand have too much influence and too much kind of control over the decisions that kind of forum makes. And so I think where Bainimarama is coming from is that he wants the responsibility of those kind of big decisions that come out of the forum to be made by Pacific leaders themselves and no longer donor countries or donor institutions.
Do you think he's right?
I mean, I think there are a few things that he is saying in the media at the moment that are certainly right. For developing countries in the Pacific, it's really important that they do take responsibility for their own issues in their countries, and for the other bigger countries, say China, also Australia, New Zealand and Indonesia even, to kind of take a step back and let those developing countries sort things out for themselves. But in saying that, there is a lot that these donor countries and institutions do for these smaller developing countries. Things, like helping them with climate change, with education, their economies. There is a reason why these other bigger, larger countries are involved in the forum, and it's to help these developing countries. So I think in a way I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time you can't really have a Pacific forum without Australia or New Zealand.
And it's interesting to me because it seems to me that what you've just made is a much more cogent case for New Zealand and Australian membership in the forum than our Prime Minister has, because John Key's response to this idea that New Zealand and Australia should leave essentially seems to be that without Australia and New Zealand, the forum wouldn't have any money to do anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be honest, John Key is coming from, again, I understand what he's saying there. He is being realistic. If Australia and New Zealand, I mean, if they were to pull out of the forum, there really wouldn't be any, let's say, money backing the forum. Losing those countries, Australia and New Zealand, would be quite a big loss to the Pacific nations. So I think he is right in a way where he's kind of laughing at the idea of Australia and New Zealand not being part of the forum anymore. But he also has to realise that maybe these Pacific islands and these Pacific nations want to make decisions for themselves. And I think although they are developing countries, it is really important that they are taking responsibility and ownership of their own issues and their own interests, I guess.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not totally sure. I'm necessarily convinced that the forum couldn't operate without New Zealand and Australian money, because I mean there seem to be plenty of Pacific regional organisations which do just that. I'm thinking of the Melanesian Spearhead Group or the Pacific Islands Development Forum, which Bainimarama set up essentially as a challenge to the Pacific Islands Forum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really important is what Dame Meg Taylor has kind of said in the media recently about options of, she's heard the, complaints from Bainimarama about Australia and New Zealand and their involvement in the group. And I think one of the options that she came up with is that Australia and New Zealand not be cut from the group, but that they take a step back. And so I think that's one of the more realistic options that they will be looking at.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Meg Taylor, and again, it seems to me that she's engaging quite seriously with what is a genuine question. It sort of stands in a little bit of contrast to John Key's comments saying that Bainimarama is just mouthing off, and it's not to be taken seriously, but it is being taken seriously, isn't it?
It is. It's quite good that she's come out saying that one of the focuses for them is to take all these issues kind of seriously and really bring them up with in when the forum goes ahead. But I think the most important thing that she's saying is that it's up to the leaders themselves to work through those issues. It's not going to be a sort of, she's not going to be the middleman, but it's really up to them to take the responsibility that if they want an issue voiced, that they go and do that themselves.
Do we know, I mean, is there any plan to address these issues by the leaders? Because there was supposed to be some kind of a meeting in Sydney, wasn't there? But that seems to have been called off.
That's right. At the moment, there hasn't been. I think everybody was kind of looking to Sydney for the Pacific leaders to actually sort some things out before the forum, but as yet there hasn't been any meeting. So I think one of the things that Dame Taylor is looking forward to is those leaders actually following through with making the meetings and going and actually seeking out those issues to be resolved. As yet there has been nothing, so we'll have to wait in the next coming months before the forum starts.
Do you think, I suppose looking at a broader picture, do you think the forum is a relevant, effective organisation today? Does it matter who is involved?
I mean, I think it does. It's there's been a lot of kind of reports coming out saying that the Pacific Island Forums is obsolete, but I think the most important thing, the most important kind of function that it has is it brings the Pacific leaders together, including Australia and New Zealand, and giving them a kind of forum where they can voice these opinions. I think the difference between the Pacific Island Forum and the other institutions or groups like the Melanesian Spearhead Group is that it puts it on a kind of regional perspective. There's a whole lot of there's Australia, New Zealand, they're included as well. So I think there's still relevance for it. I think it's definitely needed. And also there's the money issue, and I think that's, like you were saying before, Australia and New Zealand, that's why they're needed, is because there's so much backing that if they weren't involved, there really wouldn't be kind of any resource to keep this going.
Do you think if Australia and New Zealand were to withdraw and similarly to withdraw their funding, I wonder, this is coming at a time when actually quite a lot of money is coming into the Pacific from particularly from China, I'm thinking of, or the United States. So and in fact, I think Bainimarama has suggested that perhaps if Australia and New Zealand were to stay in the forum, then China and the USA should also be allowed to join, although I'm not sure that that's seriously his position. So do you think that if the New Zealand, Australian money were to leave, that could be filled by, say, China or the United States?
I think definitely. I think that's definitely an option because China and the United States have already kind of got, they're already heavily involved in things that are going on in the Pacific, specifically in Fiji, but also in New Zealand. And I think that would definitely leave a gap for other kind of global organisations to come in and kind of help in those areas. But, for these smaller island nations, I think for them to be kind of considered seriously on a global level, I think it's really important to have those links and ties with places like China and the US, just for a sort of to keep up with the contemporary global diplomacy. I think on that level is quite important.
Do you think that they're taken seriously by countries like China and the States, or are they seen as pawns?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this stage it's, even if I can use as an example, the recent spying that's going on in the Pacific, I think at this stage they're just seen as a sort of means to an end. But I think to be able to be taken seriously on that global level, they need to really work on those networks between the Pacific and bigger countries like China and the US, and really working on that kind of global diplomacy level.
Finally then, prediction time. Do you think that there is a real possibility that New Zealand and Australia could leave the forum?
I mean, I don't. I really don't. I don't see that as a realistic option. I think even with the Pacific Forum working through their Pacific regionalism framework, it's still kind of coming about. It hasn't really, that kind of structure hasn't really been worked out yet. So I think if Australia and New Zealand were to be cut or were to leave the forum, I really think things would be more detrimental to the Pacific than beneficial.
That was the Southern Cross.
That was Alistar Kata from the Pacific Media Centre talking about the Pacific Islands Forum, should New Zealand and Australia remain.